gives me great pleasure as chairman of Cityforum to introduce this podcast, which concludes our 2021 work on space in a defence and security sense and also in the future of the economy sense, both of which have been major features of the series of discussions we've developed. We've had very welcome support from BA Systems Applied Intelligence and from BT in the preparation of the agendas, and their sponsorship has been valuable to us. We've worked extensively with the Royal Aeronautical Society and with the MOD, and I've had a particularly close connection in preparing these agendas with Air Vice Marshal Phil Lester, now at RCDS, with whom I began working when he was still at DCDC in Shrivenham a couple of years ago. Phil is joined by three remarkably good panellists. We have Jill Stuart of the London School of Economics. We have Zhanna Malekos-Smith, who has spoken for us on a number of occasions, who is a figure in CSIS and also has a chair at West Point. And we have from the commercial sector, Justin Hodges of BT, representing the sponsor of this particular podcast. I formulated several questions with Phil Lester as an opener for this particular discussion, but we wish to leave it as an unscripted occasion and develop ideas and suggestions, insights and guidance as seems appropriate as the conversation develops. The UK is seeking to build its position as a space power in circumstances where there is huge global competition, and I think Phil and our three other panellists should provide us with really interesting sort of views on how we might achieve the ambitions which the space strategy has set. Phil, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this podcast provided by Cityforum, which is the conclusion of Cityforum's series of interventions and discussions around space and what it means for the United Kingdom. Over the last 6 or so months, we've looked at the UK as a space power, the development of the UK's national space strategy, space infrastructure, security and prosperity. And we close by exploring, during this podcast, the UK in space by exploring capabilities, resources and where we need to focus going forward. We have three very distinguished commentators here today to talk about space. We welcome Justin Hodges, the Senior Specialist in Major Deal Architects from British Telecom, Dr. Jill Stuart, Visiting Fellow from the London School of Economics and Political Science, Dr. Zhanna Malekos-Smith, the Senior Associate Strategic Technologies Programme from the Centre for Strategic and International Studies and Professor at West Point. The first question that we're going to explore is around space and whether it is an ungoverned domain. Will space be an ungoverned domain where countries and entrepreneurs write their own rules? What effects would a free will or a free-for-all have on the security and prosperity? And are there any likelihood that norms and rules governing space conduct will be written and respected? So I wonder then, just asking each of the panellists then that first question around your views on whether space will be an ungoverned domain. And maybe, Jill, you'd like to set the ball rolling on that one.
Sure. So this is an area of my research, so I certainly have an opinion on this. I would suggest that there's really three main things that I think are going to ensure that there does continue to be sort of oversight. First of all, we do have a pre-existing infrastructure of international law that has been around for more than half a century. So there are 5 main treaties that govern outer space, and so far this has mostly been respected. Secondly, I think you have to appreciate that because insurance is so expensive, anyone who's putting an object into space is going to have to think about their own investment in the sort of commons that we have that's orbiting Earth. And thirdly, I think we can appreciate that people do have an investment, my research has found, in their reputation and a desire to be seen as legitimate. And this applies to countries. I think what is interesting is that now we're going to start seeing companies and commercial entities who are more active in space. Now, according to international law, they still have a responsibility to the quote-unquote launching state. So every object that's launched into outer space has to be registered with a particular launching state, which has responsibility for objects there in terms of liability. And again, going back to insurance, because collisions, the destruction of any object in space is very expensive. But countries in particular have wanted to be seen as legitimate and preserving their reputation in terms of adhering to international law and international norms in space activity. So again, what's going to be interesting is whether or not commercial entities also buy into this sort of normative structure.
Thank you, Jill. Justin, your thoughts from a commercial perspective?
I'd agree that I think particularly with some of the entrepreneurs, they have to respect that body of law and custom that's been built up over a considerable time. Will they write their own rules? Well, I think they will. And that doesn't conflict with the governance aspects. The fact of life is that they're bringing a really interesting, innovative use cases to space. And we're particularly interested on our BT side because, of course, we're downstream. We're interested in understanding how we can use these emerging technologies for the benefits of our customers and society in general. They will write their own rules like any entrepreneur does in that level of innovation. The really interesting aspect is how that might have to look at the current governance and understand how that governance might need to develop in the future as they start to find their way there. And of course, a lot of that governance has been involved in principally the geo piece, except obviously the launch aspect is the same for everyone. But I think this new uptake in particularly the entrepreneurs in the LEO orbital ranges actually really does mean that they're going to be writing their own rules, and that a lot of the governance and international law giving bodies are going to have to look at that and understand how they're going to react to that over time.
Thank you, Justin. And Zhanna, your thoughts, if I may.
Thank you, Phil. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I will just note at the beginning that the views expressed here are my own and are not reflective of the Department of Defense, West Point, or the Center for Strategic and International Studies. But building off of Justin's point about concerns of governance here, I find it very striking that recently the head of the European Space Agency, Joseph Aschbacher, expressed concern about wealthy entrepreneurs sort of unduly shaping the new commercial space economy as it emerges, and specifically mentioned several entrepreneurs by name like Elon Musk, who he thought would be effectively writing the new rule book in space and preclude other European companies from exploring the potential of commercial space. And in Director Aschenbacher's interview with Financial Times, he specifically said that space will be much more restrictive in terms of frequencies and orbital slots, and the governments of Europe collectively should have an interest to give European providers equal opportunities to play on a fair market. And in terms of recent ambitions announced by Elon Musk's company, SpaceX, the company anticipates spending up to $30 billion to expand Starlink's constellation of commercial satellites for internet services in low Earth orbit, which was touched upon earlier in Justin's remarks. There are also significant safety concerns as more and more commercial actors emerge into this space. And it raises the question, how do we ensure the safe management of space? How are we overseeing traffic management in this domain so that it is a fair marketplace for other commercial actors to emerge, explore, and continue to push the innovative envelope?
Building on that conversation and the work Elon Musk and his organisation are doing, and again, ESA's concern, I wonder whether you can take that concern one step further. That's Elon Musk doing what appears as a business enterprise. It's about developing capability for wider good. What about the risk of hostile states using the tech industry, enterprise innovation in the commercial area to mask dual-use military applications under the umbrella, if you like, of routine and normal commercial activity? Do you see that sense of blurring? Maybe Jill, again, back to you.
I certainly do, but what I would emphasize is that that's nothing new. I mean, the issue of dual-use technology has been present from the very first launch of Sputnik in 1957, and so it's something that we always have to keep an eye on. And I suppose that what is unique is this idea of there being a commercial sort of Trojan horse potentially for hostile actors to now enter into space activity. But the issue has always been there.
I think we are increasingly seeing the two missions blended. And it reminds me in some ways of the Schrodinger's cat example, the thought experiment that illustrates the paradox of superposition, when you can have an asset in space that might be used for innocuous purposes, for promoting communication or global positioning, or it could be used as a passive defense measure to promote space situational awareness. But if it's also equipped with that ability to be flipped to be an offensive tool, that's a fair concern as well. So the ability to blend offense defense capabilities with space assets here, and you don't know what you don't know, that concern I think will not diminish. It will increase as more and more actors enter the commercial space sector, and this becomes an increasingly weaponized area. I did not say militarized, because space has been militarized from the get-go, but an increasingly weaponized area. How do we have a conversation around that, promoting transparency and trust and building space situational awareness, so that we do not see this escalation of offense-defense theory playing out in space?
Justin, any thoughts?
I'd agree that risk has always been present, but I think that it's a finite resource in terms of orbital planes and in terms of frequencies. And in that sense, it is a bit of a gold rush, isn't it, in terms of trying to move to that point. Since we're sort of focusing on Elon Musk, he has the ability both on the launch and in terms of technology, as well as the actual wealth to be able to push that forward. I think the interesting thing is that actually almost like a 21st century sort of arms race, where actually we have a Western entrepreneur trying to grab that resource, as opposed to Russia and of China in terms of space dominance. So I think there is a risk there, but one might argue that actually encouraging Western investment into space actually negates a wider issue that is actually the dominance of that particular scarce resource, particularly in the LEO, from people that we might consider future adversaries.
Zhanna, is there a sense to which this rush to lower Earth orbit for commercial enterprise, done in a structured way, makes or reduces the threat of state-on-state drive in LEO, or do you think the two can be blended?
I would love to kickstart this, going back to the year of 1967, referring to the Outer Space Treaty, which represents the core nucleus of space law, as Jill began in her opening comments. Interestingly, it does not expressly define what peaceful purposes is in the treaty. And the treaty's preamble promotes the exploration and use of outer space for peaceful purposes in support of the common interest of humanity, but it falls short of articulating that point. And it's darkly ironic that we are still debating what peaceful purposes means in outer space. And since 1966, a minority of states like Japan, Austria, India, Mongolia, and Iran have interpreted this term in the Outer Space Treaty quite narrowly by claiming that it demilitarizes space by requiring space be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. And the historical records from the United Nations General Assembly Legal Subcommittee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space reveal that a few state delegates advocated for a stipulation that the exploration and use of outer space only serve peaceful purposes. But the majority view, held also by the United States, is that peaceful here refers to non-aggressive activities like scientific research, navigation, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So that I just find that a extremely fascinating point, that what do we mean when we say peaceful purposes in space? And we have seen language appear in several U.S. strategy documents concerning space power and the vision for developing space awareness talk about good stewardship in space.
You talked about language there, weaponized, militarized. Jill mentioned right at the beginning the different treaties that have been in place for a number of years. Do you sense that the conversation around governance, laws, norms between states, particularly those in the West that form a fairly common view, those in the East a slightly different perspective on space, and of course private enterprise maybe a different perspective? When we talk about governance, laws and norms. Are we having the same conversation? Have we got our definitions right? Or is there, to a certain extent, similar to what occurs in cyberspace, is there a chance that we're kind of talking about the same thing, but also a risk that we talk past each other? Do you think that's the case with space?
I think, to pick up on that point, some of the recent Russian anti-satellite tests, we've already mentioned that the situational awareness that we've had in the geostationary filings for some years has allowed us to understand certain things where I think there's been sort of Trojan horses, I think the term was used earlier on, and that isn't anything new. And one might argue within the idea of surveillance and reconnaissance, then that still forms the definition we've just heard of peaceful intent. But I think the game changer is the recent anti-satellite tests that have been going on, which are very aggressive, and really do start to question whether how the wider law-giving bodies might wish to look at those instances, which can they truly be described as peaceful when you're actually developing a capability to destroy spacecraft, and indeed the collateral damage, if you will, in terms of space debris that sort of creates. And I think China did a very similar thing recently, and I think interestingly India also has recently done a similar sort of activity. And so you start to see that as an increasing trend, and so you are starting to have a very different shift from that peaceful intent that you just referred to a few minutes ago.
Coming in on language, I would highlight as well that actually none of the treaties that we have in place define what outer space is. At the time when these treaties were written, it was less relevant because there wasn't really any spacecraft that were potentially crossing into that gray area. But that's something that's becoming more of an issue now. What I think is interesting, though, is that again, referring to this idea of reputation and legitimacy, is even when countries tend to play around at the margins of what is legal, they try to justify their actions in terms of those treaties. So I think one of the reasons we've seen an increase in anti-satellite tests is because it's technically not illegal. It's only weapons of mass destruction that are illegal in outer space. Something else that always sticks with me is I remember many years ago the Chinese government announced that they were going to mine the moon for the common heritage of mankind, in quotes. So I don't know what that would mean, distributing the resources to everybody on Earth. But the fact that they were considering doing something that could be seen as against the norms at the time, they still felt that they had to justify it in the language of the pre-existing treaties that we have. Something else that fits along with that is to mention, something else that's part of this discussion is this idea of congestion and overcrowding in our orbital slots. And again, this is something that we have had a legacy of in terms of international politics and law and the governance of space. In the 1970s, there was real concern that geostationary orbit was going to become overcrowded by the countries that were at the vanguard of space activity, namely Russia and the United States. And then in 1972, Canada managed to launch a satellite in a geostationary orbit. And there was a group of developing countries, they called themselves the Group of 77, that collectivized their voting power within the International Telecommunications Union and the United Nations to say, we need to have orbital slots pre-allocated for us because we're going to be excluded. It's going to become too crowded. And so this was a conversation that was had within those two forums throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s. And it actually resulted in there being a pre-allocation of orbital slots for developing countries in certain regions. However, again, using this as an analogy for what we're seeing now with discussions around congestion and space traffic management for these mega constellations that are emerging, is that it was actually technology that changed the issue with regards to geostationary orbit. So as satellites became better able to maneuver and deorbit themselves when they became no longer functioning, and also better usage of radio frequencies, it became seen as less politically salient. So it'll be interesting to me to see whether or not there will be some technological changes in how we design satellites and deorbit satellites that may hopefully, I'm being very optimistic here, but may ease some of these concerns around congestion in talking about these tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of satellites that we might be seeing launched in the near future.
Jill, if I can take your points there and your earlier points relating to, the historic treaties, for want of a better word, and the sense to which the complexities and the realities of 21st century life has really changed the way in which we view space. I mean, the military has historically talked about three domains through which it delivers military effect. It seeks to achieve successful outcomes: the maritime domain, the land domain, and the air domain. Within the last 5 or so years, we've added space and cyberspace to that. And space and cyberspace, they're not as easily boundable, if you like, as maritime and land. And also at the same time, because capabilities from and through space and from and through cyberspace fundamentally change the way in which security and defence is practiced at land, on the sea and in the air, as well as through space and cyberspace, because everything that takes place in space ultimately is about delivering an effect on the surface of the Earth or within the inhabitants of the Earth. Does labelling it a domain actually complicate the debate?
Yeah, I'd be really curious to hear what the other panelists have to say. I would just say, to some degree, I think there's an element of path dependency here. People are having this conversation of the utility over separating out these domains and whether or not we should see them more as overlapping in the gray areas, particularly with something like cyber that's not actually a geographical territory but kind of overlaps all of these areas. So, yeah, I think it's a conversation worth having, but I would just add that we are, to some degree, stuck with the pre-existing regimes and norms that have come before this that shape the conversation that we have now. That's not to say that I don't think we should look at ways to overlap and unpack some of what is there, but at the same time, I think that we couldn't and also shouldn't throw out the pre-existing language and normative infrastructure that we have in place. But I'd love to hear what other people have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to sort of chip in there because I think, obviously, from a BT perspective, we're very interested on the effects of space. And I think that, when you talk about cyber and space, it's something that, from a commercial perspective, and actually to a certain extent from a military perspective, we've always seen that as a fused idea. I think that the recent sort of focus on cyber and on space almost makes it feel like something special. And I think, Jill's absolutely right that actually it's always been there. Technology is moving it forward, and some of the technologies that are really interesting in the LEO piece are obviously, Elon Musk is, let's be clear, is going to potentially upset the telcos market, whether it be in the commercial space or in the military space. Now, that's not the first time you've had, people have those particular sort of challenges and threats, and that's the whole point behind innovation and growth and the actual way that you move an industry forward. But I think that, coming back to a few of the points, we've had these regulations for some time. We don't need to throw them away. They do need to be adapted because of these technologies. They were adapted, absolutely right, in terms of when in the 70s people were concerned about the geostationary slots being a finite resource. And a really interesting example within the LEOs is the whole idea of 5G from LEOs. Now, traditionally, certainly from the telecoms market has driven forward by high levels of standardization across the market, so you can take products from any particular vendor and actually use it in a similar way. That's not the case currently with a lot of the space satellite communications. It's very demarcated by individual satellite operators and actually isn't highly standardized. The LEO market is likely to change that in terms of Loon 5G, which is an international standard, will challenge terrestrial 5G providers, or will they complement it? I mean, we take the view that actually it's a complemented aspect, and it actually we talk about converged communications and converged networking, and that provides some really interesting dynamics from a market perspective, a civilian perspective, which is also applicable to defence uses. And of course, everything has to have that cyber aspect on it, whether you're looking towards protecting the control of the spacecraft, or whether you're trying to protect your customers or users from interference in terms of the legitimate use of those particular capabilities that come from space.
Thanks, Justin. Zhanna, did you have any input?
Yes, I'm very glad that Justin mentioned fifth generation cellular networks, the competition to develop and deploy that next generation of cellular communications, and also the race to develop 6G and 7G. So that is a significant component to looking at competition playing out in space and whether or not it should be treated as a separate domain. There are many different schools of thought on that. I will build upon the wonderful comments that have already been shared by Jill and Justin here, coming at it from the standpoint of counterspace weapons, the different categories of counterspace weapons that exist, where you have kinetic physical weapons, non-kinetic physical weapons, electronic, and then cyber, that you can use cyberspace as a way to undermine and degrade the performance of your adversaries' space systems, whether that's impeding their ability to see the battle space environment, so taking out capabilities with intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or impeding the global positioning systems, communication, little things like that degrade the overall performance of the system to ensure that your adversary does not have a good view of the battle playing field to work to your advantage. I think cyber is an attractive counterspace weapon because of the very low risk of creating orbital debris in space. And orbital debris is an indiscriminate threat to all space assets because of extenuating issues such as the Kessler syndrome. And it's once the debris is created from, whether it's an act of physical kinetic destruction or not, once that is created, it poses significant harm to other assets in that orbit. And we saw that in the recent test launch that Russia did in taking out one of its own defunct Soviet-era satellites, Cosmos 1408, I believe, in December. And the significant amount of space orbital debris that was produced from that, over 1,500 pieces were created from that event alone, and how it caused great risk to the astronauts and cosmonauts aboard the International Space Station, and also to the taikonauts on China's new Tiangong space station.
It does pose the question, doesn't it, that the kinetic effects are come to a point where it's an act of self-harm. You're not only denying your adversary, but you're also denying your own use of space, or at least constraining it. And unlike other types of domains where you can control collateral damage, one might argue that space is very different because you can't control that level of collateral damage, and the impact and the significance of that in terms of longevity of effect, there must be some form of statistical analysis that then you start to see exponential risk with minimum, with even a modicum of actual interventions, which does point towards actually some of those more traditional softer elements. I mean, some of those capabilities, the non-kinetic capabilities, we already see there are countermeasures that are designed particularly in military spacecraft. One might argue, is it time that some of the commercial space technologies start looking at those as part of the norm in terms of their architecture?
Is there anything in terms of the legal framework governing space that does need to be updated? And then kind of that really then begs the next question is, if we do get into a place where we can reach some sort of agreement about changes to the legal framework and normative behaviour in and from and through space.
Just to drop into there, I mean, it's an interesting question. Is the requirement for additional legal frameworks to stop some of the threats, as we've just discussed, in terms of moving from peaceful to more aggressive? One might argue yes. But if those those legal frameworks, for instance, coming back to the Financial Times article with ESA, are actually to try and constrain levels of innovation to allow governments and government bodies to be preeminent, simply because they can't react quickly enough and they're losing their monopoly. I'm not saying this is the case. I would just postulate that, what is the actual motivation for these legal frameworks? One you could see as being in good faith and necessary. One might argue, this is a classic commercial case of over-regulation and innovation, and it just happens to be applying to the space market at the moment, as opposed, like a lot of other markets. And we've seen the certain parts of the world look at regulation to stop other types of IT, for instance. And the question is that really beneficial in terms of driving investment, social value, sustainability, and all the other effects that you want from space? Sorry, it's an open-ended question, but it's, I think it's a difficult one to answer.
I think you're right. Jill, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to say, just more generally, one thing to note is that I think we have absolutely seen the era of big treaties for outer space. The last treaty that was drafted for outer space in the 1970s was the Moon Treaty, and it was seen to have failed because so few countries ratified it. And so we're not going to get another big sort of blanket regulation that everyone will sort of ratify and sign up to. So what's interesting about that is what we're looking at now is more sort of memorandums of understanding, intergovernmental agreements, perhaps, bipartisan agreements between just two parties or multilateral agreements. And that is a bit trickier. I think that's partly the result of there being a much larger number of entities that are invested in outer space, not just a much larger number of countries that have space capabilities, but also things like commercial entities and also public-private partnerships. So this sort of hybrid blend of private and commercial, government and commercial. And because of that, it does complicate these conversations, but it also allows, I think, for there to be a broader input. Also, I think it's interesting that in the years that I've been researching in this area, there's a lot more public awareness about space activity. I think because we rely on space activity so much as part of our sort of daily lives and infrastructure. And so you also sort of have public opinions that were much less present in the past. What do we need to think about? Mining resources is something that I think is a big part of the conversation. Again, the definition of where airspace ends and outer space begins, particularly with things like tourism. And I think there's a lot more awareness around debris and environmental impact, which perhaps goes hand in hand with a wider awareness about climate change and the environment. But how we're going to move those forward, I think that, again, instead of sort of having a written down black and white treaty that people will adhere to, you're going to have sort of a feedback loop between norms and behaviors and self-regulation within the industry, partly in recognition, as Justin was saying, of the fact that this is there's the potential for the tragedy of the commons. So you're potentially risking your own capabilities if you don't sort of adhere to norms. That goes not just for collisions, but also the use of radio frequencies. So again, a feedback loop between the evolution of these norms and then perhaps them being codified by clusters of entities that establish agreements amongst themselves, and that then will reinforce the sort of commitment to those and see which ones sort of catch on and which ones get overtaken. But it's a much more complicated conversation, but in a way I think that's a good thing because there is a lot more input and awareness around it.
Thank you, Jill. I think we'll take this point and move on from the sort of the space as an ungoverned domain and the implications thereof, and sort of switch our target now to the UK and the publication of the UK space strategy, which is quite an ambitious set of targets for the UK. I guess the first question there relates to, how realistic is that strategy to you? Is it getting after, in your judgment, the key priorities that the UK should be facing vis-a-vis space? So, Maybe, Zhanna, you would come in first on that question.
I must admit, I am not intimately familiar with the UK space strategy document that was released. I can speak much more knowledgeably on the United States space priorities framework, if you would like, that was recently released.
Okay, if we take the US priorities then, and then maybe we can use those as a handrail to have the conversation, a sort of compare and contrast, if you like, between US priorities and UK ambition. So please, Zhanna.
Certainly. So the United States Space Priorities Framework was released by the White House this month, and it outlines several core themes. One, that space is viewed as a source of American innovation and opportunity. So we see emphasis being placed on developing public-private partnerships to enhance the exploration and innovation in outer space. So at the beginning of our conversation today, we talked about that developing a partnership and the increased prominence of entrepreneurs exploring in this space. So I don't see that likely to change given the tenor of the first overarching theme of this priorities framework and encouraging more public-private partnerships in this area. But there's room for improvement in managing the issue of space traffic management for sure. The second theme is that space is a source of American leadership and strength. This is tying in the themes that came forward in the 2020 Defense Strategy Report. And then in terms of the space policy priorities, the document is very clear in saying that the U.S. national security space operations as a whole will continue to comply with all applicable international law and demonstrate leadership in both the responsible use of outer space and stewardship. Again, we see this idea of good stewardship versus peaceful purposes being emphasized here in the space environment. The United States also is committed to investing in the next generation of technologies. There's an emphasis placed on STEM education and the long-term growth as well as the sustainability of space operations. So those are the major themes that we see here of sustainability, education, space situational awareness, and helping accelerate the growth of public-private partnerships here.
Justin, do you want to come in from your perspectives on the strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, firstly, that's fantastic because there's quite clearly a very strong alignment there between the US and the UK national space strategy, and I'll sort of cover a few things which I think is just another set of words for very similar ideals and principles. And if you look at the 10-point plan from the strategy, I mean, from a unleash the innovation across the space sector. We're very keen on that. And for us, it's actually the definition of the space sector is a lot wider than the people who build the spacecraft, who launch them and operate them. When you look at the potential downstream market, which is obviously where sort of BT are very keen within our own space strategy to try and provide a much stronger downstream voice in terms of the users of a lot of these technologies to try and drive some of this innovation from our actual customer endpoint and actually be a lot more linked in with some of that innovation that we're really trying to look at. And I think to do that, to develop world-class space clusters really talks about those sorts of partnerships and that the US are looking at. And I think the upskill and the inspire our future space workforce, that starts at the STEM and really starts to understand that people are value on that. And it's really interesting in a telecoms company, as we've started over the last couple of years in the work that I've been doing with colleagues to try and develop our understanding of how we can align more with this strategy. People are fascinated in space, and Jill, you made the point earlier on that people understand it. Not only understand it, they love it. They really want to be involved in it. You get the bug. And that's we're sat here and I think we're all smiling, and I think I think you use the word stewardship, the idea of lead the global effort to make space more sustainable. Who would have thought about that being in there? And again, it talks all about the debris piece. But actually, it talks to that idea of space being an absolute finite resource, and therefore we have to look at the husbandry of it.
The only thing that I would add is I think in general, with so many projections and plans for space, I think oftentimes the timeline is a bit unrealistic. Things tend to take longer than we expect, and particularly with COVID. So in terms of what the UK has outlined in terms of their intentions, I think things might be a bit more delayed. But beyond that, I think it's absolutely realistic. And something I would highlight that I think the UK, I know I sound American, but I've actually spent more than half of my life in the UK now. I think one of the things that they've done well is to acknowledge that space is big business and that there is the potential for real economic growth and for the UK to have a slice of that sort of space economy pie, and also to recognize particularly our capabilities and being at the forefront of Nano Satellite technology. I think that it's, from what I've seen coming out of UK space and things like Catapult, I think that they are, they have some really good ideas and some achievable, feasible goals, but just that the timeline, I wouldn't be surprised if it's a bit delayed.
So if we take time as a challenging factor, along with other resource competition, to invest and to sort other areas of UK sort of economy, UK prosperity, etc. going forward. Where would you see that the UK, in terms of space, where would you see the prioritisation for the UK's focus? Accepting that those resource pressures, where do you think we should be doing the most investment to get the biggest bang for our buck, if you like?
Justin, I feel like you might be better placed on that.
Yeah, okay. I think, and you mentioned the nanosats. I mean, I think, when it comes to the space technologies, we have had a long history in there, the likes of Satellites, and there are obviously others who focused at that end, and I think the ability to start looking at space rather than from very rare, very expensive geostationary spacecraft, and start to look at the more utilitarian, short life, low investment. It sort of, there was a comment earlier on about the insurance. If you're actually looking at the business model and you're actually reducing the overall cost and actually you're building in a huge amount of redundancy in terms of your constellation, you can probably start to take greater levels of risk, and it'll be really interesting to see how that goes. So again, that could be a very, very different change in the way that you look at the launch technology, the launch market, those markets. And that's, I think, what particularly interests us in terms of, thinking about that disruptive thinking, not trying to necessarily compete with some of the more established types of sort of technologies, which are already sort of, they already have that sort of market position. I'm not saying discount it. Obviously, Airbus in this country do a huge amount of those sorts of constructions. But I think it is in that diversity. So in that sense, it's it's not about focusing your investment on something as such, other than trying to be disruptive, looking at the actual applications that you're going to be using, you're exploring those new technologies. Certainly from a BT perspective, we're very keen to try and understand a convergence story where, this doesn't discount any of the established technologies. It's actually about how it complements. A few years ago, we saw the 5G in space as a potential, the LEOs as a potential challenge to our 5G terrestrial aspirations. With our work now with the likes of ARKit on quantum key distribution, and with our recent announcement of tying up with OneWeb, we now see this more in terms of trying to look at it from an opportunity basis. And that's really interesting when it comes to trying to understand how you bring space into the normal plan of things. And we sort of discussed that earlier on. And I think that really is understanding how you can start to get that social value, both in terms of people, but also in terms of economic growth in the space market. So so not to concentrate, but more in terms of actually trying to understand how to disrupt, how to converge. I think is really where I think the UK space market, and certainly from our reading in terms of the space strategy, it gives us some linkage into those ideas.
Zhanna, Jill, any other points to add on that?
I think that was very well put, and I agree with that. And yeah, I think it makes a good point that it's hard to sort of say what sort of individual projects that might be focused on, but more on this concept. And I like the word sort of disruption. The only other thing I would add is that I think it'll be interesting to see where the UK goes with this plan for a spaceport. Which of course has been talked about for a long time and would give increased launch capabilities. I mean, on the one hand, I think it would be nice to have that sort of autonomy, but at the same time, is it worth in terms of finite investment when there are opportunities to launch through other providers? But in the long term, that's something that I would like to see happen.
Okay, I mean, we've talked over the last sort of 40 or 50 minutes, about how technology has changed, particularly since the advent of some of the earlier treaties and the first excursions into space. It's changed, quite dramatically, and it is likely over the coming years and decades that technology will advance even further. And I think linking to your point there, Jill, about the focus of the spaceport, is the UK too late for the current race for space? Should it be focusing a bound ahead? Should be finding an opportunity in the future, or does it continue to challenge in the here and now? You shake your head, so I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I think absolutely not. It's not too late. And it's funny because in some ways space is interesting, because if you are a country that has lagged behind, you can hopscotch technology. So there's an opportunity to sort of jump forward and not necessarily go through all of the heavier steps that have led up to where we are at the vanguard, at the forefront. But I think the UK has absolutely been, involved from the beginning. It has had demonstrated leadership within the European Space Agency, and so I don't think that they're behind by any means. I think they're smart and sort of focusing on the areas that they are more capable in, such as nano satellite technology, but that they have approached this in a clever way, and by no means are behind, in my opinion.
Zhanna, do you want to come in really to reflect on the American experience from its early days to where it is now, where it's going in the future, and that risk going forward, particularly if we reflect on the tail end of the Cold War and the impact on the space race on Russia, then the extent to which this current race for space has the potential to have quite considerable adverse effects on economies around the world. So I would welcome your views.
Thank you. While the race to develop and explore space is not new, a theme that we've discussed in our conversation today, what is new is NASA's announcement that it was advancing international cooperation for lunar exploration with other countries under the Artemis Accords program. The Artemis Accords referring to the principles for a safe, peaceful, and prosperous future. And building off of Jill's previous answer, is the UK too late in joining the space race? Certainly not. In fact, the UK was one of the founding members of the Artemis Accords program. This is very forward thinking in ensuring that we are having a open, transparent discussion on sustainability in space. What is peaceful purposes? Transparency, issues of interoperability, preserving our space heritage. So this is a very promising effort that is relatively new, just started in 2020 to help support transparency and growing multilateral partnerships with this. And other countries that have since signed on to the Artemis Accords since its founding. Ukraine joined as the 9th signatory. The Republic of Korea also has expressed an interest, as well as Brazil. And this NASA program aims to land the first woman and the next man on the moon. Originally, it was by 2024, but recently NASA announced that will occur no earlier than 2025. And this is a chief priority for the Biden administration's space policy, having the first woman and the next man return to the moon, and also conducting the first human mission to Mars. One area that is yet to be settled, however, is the legacy of space policy directives that were signed by President Trump during his time in office, how those directives will be carried forward, if at all, with the Biden administration when it concerns space nuclear power. The U.S. is poised to become one of the first states to launch a space nuclear propulsion system, according to Space Policy Directive 6, which prioritizes developing more advanced radioisotope power system capabilities and nuclear propulsion systems, but it's unclear whether or not that priority will be continued on under the new administration, especially that the new priorities frameworks that were published this month did not touch upon this concept of space nuclear propulsion systems. It remains to be seen how this area will develop. Regardless, the goal of returning human astronauts to the moon no earlier than 2025 is a top priority.
Thank you. Any other... Sorry, Jill, you were going to jump in.
I would just add on that, the Artemis Accords, I think, are an interesting example of this sort of new direction that we're going in terms of international law for outer space. So moving away from these big treaties, but having something like this, which is an agreement that gets put forward by a particular country, and then other countries have the opportunity to sign up to it or not. And then we see how that then influences the evolution of norms in space. So just a side note, going back to some of what we were talking about before with regards to the evolution of space governance, I think the Artemis Accords have been a high profile example of what we should be looking at in terms of regulating things like mega constellations and making sure that astronomers can see into the night sky. So yeah, it's not these big treaties, but sort of smaller agreements, and to see whether or not they gain traction and evolve a regime around them that has more adherence.
Jill, thank you. And likewise, Zhanna and Justin, thank you for the conversation over the last hour or so. I mean, we covered a lot of ground and a lot of space too, for that matter. There are a number of words that jump out to me during our conversation. I think one of probably the most used word would centre around collaboration, and the sense that, you know, we are probably well beyond the big monolithic type agreements and treaties that we had in the 60s, and we now need to build those networks and align our thinking, get in a more blended approach to how we deal with space, how we work with others who see things different to us. And I think that the language is important, and I know colleagues who look at cyberspace regularly have dialogues with Russian and Chinese colleagues to drill into specifically around the language of cyberspace, and, you know, maybe a similar program looking at that between Chinese and Russia around the space language, so that we can look at how we blend, how we can work together around that stewardship piece. And I think the stewardship is important. We recognise that space ultimately isn't there for space's purpose as we view it in this context. It's there about how it supports and contributes to life in the inner atmosphere. And therefore, you know, stewardship is key. You know, how we harness that finite resource of outer space, how we use it in an open, transparent, shared way, so we continue to reap the benefits of what it can add to the quality of our life, and also to global prosperity, stability and security as well. So I think there are some, you know, immense challenges that we face, and of course, as technology goes forwards, it's a constant process of evolution. The ability to go further, faster, the ability to regularly leave Earth's orbit, go into space, to come back, to use hypersonic technology, quantum science, so forth, again, has that ability to quite rapidly change what we do. So thank you very much for the conversation. It's been truly illuminating. And, you know, I look forward to future conversations in the future. Thank you very much to each and every one of you.